And the last one. So for me, those are three great ads, and that you notice there's sort of similarity between them in that they don't really show any product. You know, the BMW was the only one that showed the car in the end, but it was really from a long shot. It wasn't a beauty shot. The Philips one didn't show Philips TV at all or say anything about Philips TVs. And that last one for Cadbury's Dairy Milk, it just showed some, you know, a little bit of tagline thing at the end, but really it was nothing to do with chocolate. But it was such a well-established brand in the UK when they did that ad, there was nothing else they could do there's nothing they could tell people about it. They already knew what was in it, and they knew the brand name, and they knew it was the best-selling chocolate. But there was something which they wanted to connect with on an emotional level, which all of those ads do. They leave you feeling in a certain way, and that has a big impact on people's behavior, and all ads were hugely successful. The last one led to a massive increase in market share and became viral, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It did incredibly well. So they're not just bits of puffery, they're very effective commercials. Next slide, please. So I think, you know, what's happened is that the consumer has been allowed to tear up the contract that it had with marketers and corporations up until that point. And it got pissed off, you know, consumers got pissed off, and for the first time, well, over that period of time from the remote control, I guess, to the DVR, to the internet, to the mobile, etc., the consumers were allowed to shift and do other things instead, and there was therefore a change in power. And hence the need for some sort of revolution. I do say revolution on purpose because it isn't just an evolution. I think the evolution stuff rarely works when it comes to big shifts in the relationship between brands and consumers. So next slide, please. And the reason we called it punk marketing, I co-authored the book with a friend of mine called Richard Lemmer. The reason we called it punk marketing because it seemed very similar to what happened to the music, to the consumption of music in the mid-70s. If you look at the lovely Carpenters on the left, you know, great manufactured pop up until the mid-70s, a complacent music industry playing pop music to a bored audience. And what happened with punk in the mid and late 70s was it was music created for the people, by the people, and it was raw and had full of energy. And I think that's the same sort of revolution that's required with marketing. And it's starting to happen, but it's too far in between. Next slide, please. Next slide. And next slide. So there are a few rules or principles that we delivered in the Punk Marketing Manifesto as part of our book. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but there are about 14 of them. But one of them is about taking risks. And, you know, it becomes a little bit of a platitude, but it's, you need to avoid risk or die in this world. You cannot afford in marketing now to do things that have always been done and assume that they'll work in the future. For instance, take a web film called Subservient Chicken, which became very successful in the US about 4 years ago. And it was a very small film in terms of a small budget film, but it was going to be impossible to judge in advance whether it was going to work. You couldn't buy the reach and frequency that would justify its cost. But it was worth it as an experiment. And the way it worked, if you might remember the thing, was it was you'd go online and you'd see this big chicken, a guy in a chicken suit, and it looked like it was a webcam, and you could type in anything like dance, and the chicken would dance, and it looked like it was live. You know, people couldn't understand how it was actually done because you could type in anything, and it would actually do it. And the way it was done, by the way, was they sent out, the people in the agency, it's the agency I used to work for, they sent out emails to all the agency staff saying, what would you get the chicken to do? And people would respond back saying, take off your clothes, jump on the couch, run around the room, flap your wings. And after about 400 responses, they realized that they had all the answers. In other words, nobody was sending anything new. So they then shot lots of bits of film with all of those answers in, and then it's a simple algorithm for when you typed in a question, it recognized that and play that bit of film. And people just couldn't get how that worked. You know, they didn't know the sort of technology behind that. And within a week, the film had 52 million hits. Hugely, hugely successful, and led to the growth and sales of the chicken sandwich, which is what it was advertising. And the whole purpose of that film was to promote this brand line called Have It Your Way, which is Burger King's new brand theme. So next slide, please. And that was some stills from the campaign. I think it's still up there. Next slide. So another principle is not to make any assumptions. And there are many assumptions here which I think have been taken for granted in marketing that actually aren't true. Probably never have been true, but are certainly not true now. So reaching a mass audience is cost effective. Not necessarily. It depends if those people like what you're putting out to them. Repeating the same message will make it stick. When I started in advertising, it used to be you had to make sure people saw an ad three times before they got it. Not true. If others are doing it, it must be good. So I can follow what other people are doing, and I can do a Philips carousel film if I'm Toshiba or Sony, and perhaps people will like me just as much. That's not true. People treat advertising differently to content. Not true either. It used to be maybe the case that you would have, and now a message from our sponsors, and the ads could be that sales message. But over time, advertising and marketing is now on the same level as content. It has to be as good, if not better, in order to people to engage with that. It is becoming content. So I find the blurring so much that I don't know what the difference is anymore. All publicity is good publicity. Clearly not true. There's lots of bad publicity. And again, with this passing in power to consumers, there's many examples of where people are saying very, very negative things about your product. If you put yourself out there, you've got to be prepared for some sort of bad feedback as well as good feedback. And lastly, marketing is a science. And I'm going to come back to that again. But I think you can understand why, but people like to justify themselves in terms of figures and rationality. But you can only do it up to a certain point. There's always going to be that gap you cannot monetize, and you cannot rationalize, you cannot add facts and figures to. So next slide, please. So there are a couple of campaigns which have broken the rules. And this is one, Campaign for Real Beauty, very well-known case. I won't go into too much detail. But what it did is it looked at industry conventions and say, I'm not sure those are true. And the industry convention in this case was that in order to advertise beauty products, you had to have amazing-looking people. And people couldn't relate to that. Women couldn't relate to that in terms of that idealized perfection or ideally sense of beauty. So they did a different campaign, which was all about celebrating imperfections. There's another example which is P&G did, and P&G is quite an interesting marketer. They usually do big mass media campaigns, and they're a big buyer of TV advertising, but they had a problem. They had this detergent in Israel called Biomat, and they were trying to reach Orthodox Jews. Orthodox Jews do not watch TV. So how could you reach them in a way that spoke to them on their terms? And what they did was they drove round big trucks in the neighborhoods of Israel, where the Orthodox Jews lived, with washing machines on the back, and they had a clothes donation drive. So they were asking for donations of used clothes, which they were going to donate to the poor, and they washed them there and there in the trucks. So they showed the effect of Biomat detergent on the clothes and how cleaner it made them, but also did a good social campaign, socially helping people in that community. And that's a great way of changing the rules about through marketing in a different way. Next slide, please. Another thing is, consumers aren't always right. And I am a big believer in research, but I'm a big believer in research done well or done correctly. Next slide. There are many brands, big successful brands and products, which have been launched without any information, market research at all. And I think it's important to understand that there are times and places to use research and get a check on whether things are going well and course correct. There's also a need to get lots of information up front about products and markets and trying to understand consumers' lives. But you can never ask a consumer whether you should launch this particular brand because they do not know. You know, and and this I think applies to content creators just as much, which is you cannot hope to get information about whether it is a good idea. All you can do is get as much information about the consumers and the market you're working in. Next slide. So another principle of this, what I'm calling revolution, is define your enemy. Like, work out who your enemy is. And I believe that every brand, every marketer has an enemy. Richard Branson has made a huge business, an $8 billion business with 30,000 employees around the world, of defining the enemy as the conventions of the industry, whether it's airlines or trains or banking or vodka or cola. When he launched he launched Virgin Cola in the United States back in about 1999, 2000. He did two confrontational things with a sort of tongue-in-cheek things. One was he drove a World War II tank down Fifth Avenue in New York, painted pink, which was the color of the cola. And the second thing he did was he challenged the chairman of Coca-Cola to an arm wrestling match. And he had a full-page ad in the New York Times saying, "Doug Ivester, CEO of Coke, I challenge you to an arm wrestling match. Loser to quit selling your cola in North America." The CEO of Cola declined to comment on that one. But the enemy doesn't necessarily have to be another brand in the category. It can be a whole industry or an attitude. And if you take the Truth campaign, which was, again, done by the agency Crispin Porter Bogusky that I used to work for, Truth was designed to prevent teenagers from smoking. It was a huge problem in the States. And for the previous 30 years, up until about 2001, the growth of teenage smoking had been going up year by year. And nothing in terms of